Hi and welcome everyone to the panel of today that we're going to start right now. The panel's name, this is the second in the series of post-capitalism markets and planning panels. And the panel's name, as you know, is Postcapitalism, what role for markets and what role for planning. Today we have three panelists, and I'm going to shortly introduce them, and then I'm going to leave the floor to them. All of our panelists are going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have about 25 to 30 minutes of general discussion. So welcome again, and thank you for being here. So our first speaker is Pat Devine. Pat Devine is an economist and an honorary researcher at Manchester University, UK. Negotiated coordination, his democratic economic planning model presented in 1989, proposes a distinction between market forces and market relations. Our second speaker is Anke Schaffartzik, is a researcher at the Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna. Her work focuses on social metabolism, global resource uses, and international division of labor. And our third speaker is David Schweickart, as a philosopher emeritus from Loyola University Chicago, who also has a PhD in mathematics. He has devoted a large portion of his career to developing and defending an economically viable, ethically desirable alternative to capitalism, a model of market socialism that he calls economic democracy. So I'm welcoming our panelists and our participants to the panel once again. And Pat, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much. Post-capitalism. What are the values that we would like to see a post-capitalist society, what I think of increasingly as an eco-socialist society, to allow us to achieve? Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that under capitalism, essentially what happens is that economic activity, the capitalist economy, controls and shapes the rest of society. And we want to reverse that if we're moving to a post-capitalist society in which society controls economic activity and shapes it according to the needs of people and non-human nature, rather than people and non-human nature being shaped to the needs of capitalism. So that's the first value. And for me, that would enable the flourishing, the life enhancing of the sustainability of people and non-human nature. Both are important. It would also enable us to overcome alienation. The alienation from ourselves, from others, from work, and from the product of our activities. Now, for this to happen, if society is going to control economic activity and mediate its relationship with non-human nature, then we have to have social control of economic activity, which I argue is best achieved through participatory institutions and processes, and that they enable society to mediate its relationship with non-human nature. Now, currently, I think there are three models of socialism, if you like, three families of models of socialism. One is market socialism. The other is a form of direct allocation or electronic socialism, usually involving an iterative process of tâtonnement in which there is a convergence of the bids or activities of the different participants, economic producers, people as consumers, people as citizens, people who live in different localities, and so on. Now, what I want to do is to propose a number of criteria in terms of which we can evaluate these different families of model according to whether they contribute to the achievement of the values that we want to realize in a post-capitalist society. The first criterion, I would argue, not of course proponents of market socialism would agree, but what I would argue is that we need to evaluate models in terms of whether or not they abolish market forces. Market forces, as we know, are what Adam Smith called the invisible hand and Marx called the anarchy of production. And market forces give rise to outcomes that no one willed. Market forces result in economic activity controlling and shaping society rather than the other way round. It's important, I think, to distinguish between market forces and market exchange. Market exchange has occurred throughout the ages, even in societies where economic activity is not shaped by market forces. Secondly, I think it's very important that we recognize the ubiquity of incommensurability when it comes to thinking about the things that contribute to human well-being and non-human nature. These different items are not reducible to a single monetary measure. They are, for example, tacit knowledge acquired by individuals through their own experience. Martinez Allier has a very important discussion of the fact that sacredness, a very important consideration for many people, cannot be given a monetary value. It cannot be reduced to a single monetary unit. Different sorts of non-human nature, similarly. Neoclassical environmental economics used to think of non-human nature as a form of capital, which could be equated to human capital, social capital. Gradually, they were forced to realize that there are actually some forms of non-human nature which have to have physical limits, planetary boundaries that can't be reduced to a monetary value, which can be traded off against other monetary values. And this, I think, means that cost-benefit analysis, which does exactly that, and I think I would include in that cost-benefit analysis, which includes social costs and social benefits, even the costs of the use of or the destruction of non-human nature. Then thirdly, that gives rise to the need for multi-dimensional criteria when evaluating different courses of action and different models. And finally, a transformatory process, I think, is needed for what in classical Marxist terms would be the transition from the lower to the higher stages of communism. As Marx put it in the critique of the Gotha program, what we have to deal with is a society as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus, in every respect, economically, morally, and politically, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. So when we're thinking of a post-capitalist society, this is, if you like, initially a society as emerged from capitalist society and which has all the characteristics imposed upon people and human processes of capitalist society. So we need, in the sorts of models of post-capitalist society that we're thinking about, we need a transformatory process. Now, what that does, that brings me to an evaluation of different families of post-capitalist economic and social organization. First of all, there is market socialism. Now, I see market socialism as having a contradiction at its heart between, on the one hand, the need to recognize the autonomy of enterprises in their pursuit of their objectives, usually profit, and on the other hand, the restrictions imposed upon the autonomy of such enterprises because of the adverse social and non-human adverse effects those market forces have. And this, I think, was very clear when in the transition from the central planning model of the socialist countries to a more flexible, localized system. In the Hungarian new economic mechanism, they tried to combine enterprise autonomy with restrictions on that autonomy in order to stop inequality developing, in order to stop adverse effects developing. And they found that there was a contradiction between, on the one hand, the autonomy, and the other hand, the restrictions on that autonomy. Karl Polanyi himself put it that the free market imposes adverse consequences on both human beings and non-human nature. That gives rise to social movements to check the operations of the free market. But those social movements, those social restrictions reduce the efficacy of the free market system, what he used as a term to mean capitalism. So that's the basic contradiction that I see underlies the concept of market socialism. When it comes to electronic socialism, that is to say, where various individuals, enterprises, communities put forward their plans, their bids of what they'd like to do. These are then integrated in some central planning board or some iterative processing board. And through a process of iteration, you move towards some sort of social equilibrium. Now, I think this is incompatible with widespread incommensurability and the need for multidimensional criteria and a transformatory learning process. Finally, there's my own model of negotiated coordination, which builds on the achievement of working class and popular struggles to defend democracy from the political sphere to the economic sphere. And it meets all the criteria. So the model is based upon, first of all, social ownership. Decisions should be taken by those people and groups who are going to be most affected by those decisions. Implementation, similarly, needs to be undertaken by those who are going to be affected by the implementation. Secondly, we need to have a system of subsidiarity, different levels of human activity, whether it's the very local, the regional, the national, the international, the global, have different consequences. Decisions taken at these different levels have different consequences for people, and therefore there's a sense in which the social owners at each level of subsidiarity will differ. Thirdly, we have to have negotiated coordination. That is to say, we have to have a system in which quantitative and qualitative information is combined, and the people who are going to be affected by the decisions made take account of both sorts of information and decide by negotiating between them what is the best course of action in any given circumstance. And this doesn't, I think, involve too many meetings, as Oscar Wilde put it, because after all, in our society today, most people spend most of their time running things, and most people spend most of their time being run. Now, if we actually get rid of that distinction, that social division of labor between those who run things and those who are in different ways run, then it means that we would all participate in all the different aspects of lives, not at every single moment in every single decision, but in the course of each stage of our lives. So we would participate in running organizations, making those decisions. We would participate in professional activities. We would participate in skilled labor and any unskilled activities that are required, again, we would all take our fair share of, rather than at the moment, most of us spending most of our time doing one type of activity. Now, that's not to say that the functional division of labor would be abolished. It's not to say that within each social grouping, there wouldn't be different sorts of things. You'd still have plumbers and carpenters and bricklayers. You'd still have solicitors and doctors. You'd still have teachers and professors of different disciplines. But you'd abolish the fact that we all spend most of our lives doing activities and, broadly speaking, the same sort of activity. And of course, when it comes to caring work, which is extremely important and which in our society is undervalued and not normally recognized, then it would be important to recognize again that the need to make sure that we all take our fair share of caring activities would be the case. Now, if we do that through a process of participatory deliberative democracy, we're in a transformatory learning process. It enables us to abolish the social and functional division of labor. It overcomes, therefore, alienation. It promotes a sustainable, flourishing human and non-human nature. And I'd just like to end by saying that when it comes to non-human nature, the focus and current discussion is largely on climate change, understandably so, but it's increasingly true that the loss of biodiversity is an equally important factor which we have to take account of. And so a deliberative process through which we can take account of both the quantitative and the qualitative information relevant to decision making is what I see as the way forward for a post-capitalist social economic system. What, if you like to coin a phrase or to adapt a phrase, we could say eco-socialism, not barbarism.
Thank you, Pat, for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking intervention. And it's nice to share this virtual panel with you, let me say. And I'm gonna pass it on to Anke. But before I do that, I did put it on chat, but let me reiterate: at any point in the presentations or talks, you can definitely use the chat and the Q&A boxes for comments or questions you have for the panelists, but there will also be time to have your actual voice heard at the end of the panel by using the raise hand icon, but that will be at the end. But feel free to please intervene in the discussion with the chat box. I will be keeping an eye on it. And I'm gonna pass it on to Anke.
I'm happy to go, but I think in terms of the schedule, I thought David was next. I don't want to be speaking out of turn.
Okay, David, you can go to. I just I might have messed up the order of the speakers, but yeah.
Or maybe I'm wrong. I don't.
If you have a preference, please. Okay, I think it is David, but the bios and the, okay, David, please go ahead. I'm sorry, Anke.
It's fine, sorry. David, I think your microphone is still muted.
So it's unmuted. How's that? That better? Okay. Now, I just see myself a little bit up in the corner here, but that's okay. I'm going to read a paper because I got a lot to say. In a certain sense, I want to sum up the research project I've had for the past 45 years and sort of lay it out with a specific model of post-capitalism. But let me begin with a book that I read 50 years ago. The summer between leaving my position as a beginning professor of mathematics at the University of Kentucky and going on a different course, pursuing another PhD, this time in philosophy. And that summer between leaving mathematics and starting philosophy I decided to read Marx. I never read Marx before. And I decided to read Das Kapital. And I was bracing myself for an atheistic screed. It wasn't that. In fact, it was about something I really hadn't thought about, before. Our economic system, where it came from, how it works, and about this invisible exploitation that Marx is talking about. And I read this book, like the mathematician that I was. I read every sentence, I worked through every equation, and there's lots of equations in the first part of Capital. I read every footnote, and it really just changed my life. I've never gotten over that experience, But one thing that struck me was that Marx's critique of capitalism is in essence a two-part democratic critique. Workers in an enterprise have no democratic control over their conditions of work. Citizens collectively lack democratic control over the disposition of the surplus, which is going to be invested in ways that are going to determine the future, of your society. There's something else important about Marx's critique of capitalism that should be noted, something he himself may not have realized. Marx's critique is really not a critique of the market per se. Generations of Marxists have thought that so, but that's really not the case. So the first part of Capital, where the above argument is developed, it begins with the commodity and traces a rather abstract Hegelian fashion the development of the market, from barter to money-mediated exchange to money buying commodities and getting more money back. And we reach the famous Marxian Paradox. And this one I need to get a screen share down. Here it is. Okay, and this is what I want. Okay, and okay, let's see. Okay, the Marxian Paradox. Commodity exchange for commodity, barter, then money-mediated exchange. You buy something with money, and then you sell it to buy another commodity. I'm sorry, but then you buy a commodity and sell it for another commodity, and the money that comes back is more than what you started with. But if equals always exchange for equals, which is the assumption Marx makes on the model, how can M become M prime with M prime greater than M? I remember as a mathematician being startled by this analytic question, which I had not seen coming, and deeply impressed by Marx's solution. He calls the reader's attention to one very special commodity, labor power, the capacity a worker has to work, which is different from the amount of work the worker is going to have to do once hired. The value of the former, the wage the worker works, is determined by the market, but not the latter. The latter, which for Marx is essentially the length of the working day, is determined by class struggle. So notice, we're no longer talking about the standard commodity market, markets for goods and services, but a different sort of market, the labor market. And indeed, if we follow the logic of capital, we see that the basic market for goods and services, there isn't any exploitation. Exploitation enters with the commodification of labor. The transparent class exploitation underlying slave and feudal societies gives way to an invisible form of exploitation. Supposedly rooted in freedom, the free negotiation between the employer and the employee, over the wage. Moreover, as this new market develops, it gives rise to a third market, markets controlling the disposition of the surplus, the capital market. Hence, we see that the market in a capitalist society is in fact a triple market, a market for goods and services, a labor market, and a capital market. Marx's critique is not in fact a critique of the market per se, but the labor market and the capital market. Suddenly, theoretical space opens up at the heart of Marx's critique for market socialism, at least as I define it. Okay, Capitalism, the basic structure, we have markets for goods and services. Enterprises compete with one another to provide consumers for what they want and are able to pay for. Labor markets, one's capacity to work is a commodity like any other to be bought and sold. People must compete for jobs, and once hired, do as they are told. And capital markets, private financial institutions raise money from those who have excess and lend it to businesses promising the highest profitability. Now, this model has proven strengths, but also grievous weaknesses. What might an economically viable, ethically desirable alternative look like? Let's imagine an economic system called economic democracy. It keeps the first set of markets, competitive markets for goods and services, but replaces most wage labor with cooperative labor and replaces financial markets with more democratic mechanism for handling investment. This will be a form of socialism that's structurally different from past and present examples of actually existing socialism, and for those welfare state capitalist models that sometimes are called socialist. The basic model for economic democracy: retain competitive markets for goods and services. These will be regulated so as to protect the health, safety, and environment, but enterprises will compete with one another in selling goods and services to consumers. Not all goods and services, healthcare, education, retirement security, and others will be designated public goods financed by taxes. We will then democratize labor. Most businesses in economic democracy are quite different from what they are under capitalism. They are not entities that can be bought or sold. They are communities. When you join a firm, you have the right to vote for members of a worker council, just as most of us have the right to vote now for a city council or town council governing the place we live. These worker councils appoint upper management and oversee major enterprise decisions. And ultimately, authority rests with the workers, one person, one vote. Democratize capital. Some of the democratic control of investment is essential. Oh, I left out one part of the democratizing labor. As for income, all workers in the enterprise share the enterprise's profits. The portions need not be equal. Relative size will be determined democratically by workers, but everyone's income will be tied directly to the firm's performance, since everyone is incentivized to work diligently and to see that your coworkers, are doing the same. Okay, democratize capital. Some sort of democratic control over investment is essential if an economy is to develop rationally. Given the ecological challenges we now face, rational development has never been more urgently needed. Investment decisions made today will shape fundamentally our collective future. Public control over investment is essential. But public democratic control of investment is impossible if we must rely on private investors to generate and allocate the funds. Instead of counting on private investors to do either, economic democracy will generate its investment fund publicly and transparently via a capital assets tax, which is basically a flat rate property tax, on all businesses. The revenue from this tax constitutes the National Investment Fund. All such revenue is reinvested in the real economy, not saved in Wall Street securities, for there is no Wall Street in this model. Income and consumption taxes will fund other government services and ongoing expenses. These publicly generated funds are allocated according to a combination of national, regional, and community planning, as well as market criteria. A certain portion of the National Investment Fund is set aside for national public projects, while the rest are allocated to various regions of the country. Regions do not compete for capital. Instead, each region receives, as a matter of right, each and every year its fair share, generally its per capita share, of investment funds. That is to say, capital comes to where the workers are. Workers don't have to chase after ever mobile capital. Some of these regional funds are set aside for public investment that are regional in scope. The remainder go to communities and also on a per capita basis, where it's channeled to public investment banks. but lend it to enterprises wanting to upgrade their technologies, restructure their businesses, or expand production, as well as to individuals or groups wanting to start new businesses. These loans will be granted on the basis of economic viability and social criteria, the latter including, importantly, environmental impact. Information as to who gets the loans will be publicly accessible to all to keep corruption, in check. This public investment system makes coherent long-term investment planning at the national, regional, and community level possible. The allocative mechanism is straightforward and transparent, unlike the utterly opaque Wall Street-dominated institutions, in which the future, at least among high-tech traders, is often measured in microseconds. As the economist James Galbraith has remarked, markets are good in many ways, but they have two fundamental defects. The poor don't count, and the future doesn't count. So that's the basic model of economic democracy. Just to quickly summarize, ultimate authority rests with the workplace, one person, one vote, and each worker's income is a share of the profits, not a contractual wage. And democratic control of investment. Investment funds come from a capital assets tax, not from private savings. These funds are distributed to public banks in each region on a per capita basis. These funds are then loaned to businesses using economic and other democratically determined criteria. Okay, I should say this is a model, and models, the real world is always more complicated than an abstract model, but you need a model, I think, to get a picture of how the system is supposed to work. Now, I have three supplements that I want to talk about briefly to this basic model. The government as employer of last resort, an entrepreneurial capitalist sector within socialism, and this fair trade, not free trade. Now that's the international implications of all of this. I think I'm going to have to put that on hold till maybe question and answer. But let me start with the government as employer of last resort. A long-held tenet of socialism is that everyone who wants to work should have access to a job. In economic democracy, everyone will have a genuine right to work. If a person cannot find work elsewhere, the government will provide employment, low wage but decent, doing something useful. The entrepreneurial capitalist sector. This is a provocative addition, justified in part by facilitating the transition from capitalism to post-capitalism. Marx's analysis of capitalism focuses on the capitalist qua capitalist, the provider of capital. This provision of capital is an allocative function, not a creative one, which the state can readily take over, as it does in our basic model. Another part is played by some capitalists, the creative entrepreneurial role. It's played by a large number of petty capitalists who set up their own small businesses, but also by a smaller number of grand capitalists who turn innovative ideas into major industries. Although workplace democracy will be the norm in economic democracy, not all businesses need conform. Anything but parasitic, the petty capitalist works hard, brings energy, initiative, intelligence to the task of running a small business. Small businesses provide jobs for large numbers of people and goods and services to even more. They will continue to play a vital role in our socialist economy. There's also an honorable role in our new system for entrepreneurial capitalists who operate on a grander scale, introducing major technological and organizational innovations. These capitalists can hire as many workers as they want, grow their business as large as they want, become quite wealthy. Of course, there will be income and wealth taxes to keep this inequality, in check. Now, this entrepreneurial capitalist class need not pose a serious threat to the democratic structures of our economy. Democratic firms, when they have equal access to investment capital, need not fear competition from such capitalist firms. On the contrary, since these capitalist firms must compete with democratic firms for workers, they will be under pressure to at least partially democratize through their own operations, through, for example, maybe profit sharing or more workplace participation. Moreover, a rather simple legal mechanism can keep this capitalist class in check. The basic role played by the capitalists under capitalism is not the active entrepreneurial role, which relatively few actually play, but their passive role is richly rewarded suppliers of investment capital, the investors. Since economic democracy substitutes revenues from the capital assets tax for investment capital provided by these capitalists, the trick is to develop a mechanism that will prevent the active entrepreneurial capitalist from becoming the passive parasitic one. The mechanism is a simple law with three parts. An enterprise developed by an entrepreneurial capitalist can be sold at any time, but if it succeeds a certain size, sold only to the state at a price determined by the value of its capital assets. Smaller firms can be sold to other private individuals. An enterprise beyond a certain size must be sold to the state when the owner retires, dies, or moves on to another venture. And when the state purchases the enterprise, it will be turned over to the enterprise's workers to be run democratically. A state agency will supervise the transition. Bottom line, in economic democracy, entrepreneurial capitalists foster innovation and new democratic enterprises, but they do not control the economy nor the political system. They have an honorable role to play in our socialist society. Okay, conclusion. Let me close this on a philosophical note. There's an important philosophical tradition embracing Kant and Hegel as well as Marx that regards the human species as engaged in a process of creating an ever more rational world grounded in freedom. The process is slow, often opaque, often subject to reversals, and yet ultimately there's a direction to history, and it has a direction that should give us hope. I think there are good grounds for endorsing this view. We are, after all, a deeply pragmatic species with the astonishing capacity for creative development. When confronted with problems, we try to solve them. We experiment. We learn from our mistakes. If a solution exists, sooner or later, we hit upon it. If we're lucky, later won't be too late. Consider the present situation. We live in terrifying times, and I'm thinking of, above all, global warming here. But in a very real sense, they're miraculous times. Consider, it's miraculous, is it not, at precisely the moment when our technologies have reached the point where we can actually determine with near certainty that the globe is warming, and we know what is causing this. Now notice, if the chemistry of our atmosphere had been a little different, this could have been happening 2 centuries ago when we started burning all this fossil fuel. We wouldn't have known what was going on. There'd be weather perturbations. We had no way of knowing the globe was getting warmer. And we certainly wouldn't know this invisible gas that was being burned was suddenly causing all these problems. So we know that now. But at precisely this time, our technologies have also reached the point that we can replace, these carbon burning fossil fuels with technologies that don't require that, don't emit greenhouse gases. Indeed, we have the resources now, even though we've got 8 times the population that existed during Marx's time, with providing every human being on this planet with a decent, sustainable life. Now we're reaching a point where more and more people are coming to realize that the old order has exhausted itself and is incapable of solving the problems it's created. Large numbers are not far from seeing that there is indeed a better way beyond capitalism. This prediction is based on the premise that the democratic impulse has not yet exhausted itself, nor the impulse to make our world a freer and more rational place. These impulses, of course, will be resisted. Those currently in control will not yield willingly. Marx was certainly right about the centrality of class struggle. He was overly optimistic, I think, about the inevitability of a world in which the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all. We cannot say with certainty that democracy, freedom, and rationality will prevail. What we can say with near certainty is there will be a struggle, and if progressive forces are to win, it will involve the efforts of millions. The slogan was articulated by the global justice movement 2 decades ago: another world is possible. That other world, the one for which more and more people are fighting, will be one in which democracy has penetrated to the core of our economic life. Let me end with a short poem. that I've been citing a lot recently. A poem by the Irish Nobel laureate poet Seamus Heaney, quoted, interestingly enough, by the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen in his book, The Idea of Justice. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of history, of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Here's the alternative. A New Yorker cartoon of cover in 2011. We can't let this happen. Thank you.
And thank you, David, for your very thoughtful and thorough intervention. And we're actually not running late. That's like that's a miracle. So that gives us a lot more time to discuss some of the ideas that are emerging. And I really want to pass it on to Anke this time and invite her to start her intervention. And since we're kind of ahead of our scheduled time, I might invite our panelists to shortly react to each other's interventions, because I think there are really good and interesting, thought-provoking lines, threads of discussion that are already emerging. So Anke, please go ahead.
Thank you, Benji. Then I will do my very best to make sure that we stay within the time that we've now gained, so I don't take away our discussion time. I'm just setting up my screen share and my presentation. Let's see if it works. And I don't see the chat, but I'm hoping that someone will give me like a visual signal in case something goes wrong with my sound or my presentation or anything. Great. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to take, I think like everything I want to say, it's going to take me all of that to get to where Pat started. So, you know, we're coming full circle in a way, but I hope that it will still be useful, and we'll see some other things on the way that we haven't talked about yet and we haven't heard about yet. So what I want to propose is to take an ecological economics perspective to this topic. So to look at our economic system and also any future potential economic system as a subsystem of our society, our social system, and to look at that, consider that social system as a subsystem of our natural environment. And I hope I can convince you that that's also a very important analytical perspective if we're going to be thinking about transformation of the world we have now. And of course, that if we look at economy and society as embedded in the environment in this way, then it means that the forms that our economic systems and our social systems can take on, they're, even though maybe it seems like that to a certain extent right now, they're still not arbitrary, but they're limited by planetary and also by social boundaries, right? And the way that we're using our environment right now, and this is of course from the Stephen et al. Publication on planetary boundaries, we're already passing a lot of these boundaries right now, which of course then limits the option space we have in terms of the economic and social systems that we can have in the future, we can realize in the future. So it's not a free-for-all anymore. And within that notion of understanding our social system as a subsystem of that environment, that this means, of course, that any form of reproduction of a social system is contingent upon what in social ecology we refer to, with a nod to Marx, we refer to as social metabolism. So it's contingent on the material and energy inputs, the social stocks, and I'll get into that in more detail, and then also the outputs that society has to have in material and energy terms. And if we think about this, then of course it becomes very clear, even if we were not familiar with the data, that the metabolic rate, so the level of per capita resource use at any given point in time, the distribution and also the composition, so what types of resources are being used, are dependent on societal organization to a much greater extent than they are dependent upon individual metabolic needs, right? So the different levels of resource use, we see only a very small part of that has something to do with the calories each and every one of us needs to survive per day, for example. And this becomes very clear if we look at what's in the chart here, which is just a comparison of the energy consumption in gigajoules, so in a unit of energy per capita in year, across different subsistence types. And of course, this is very strongly generalized. And as you can see by not just by the squares, but also by the lines, there's a broad range within each of those types. But just to get like a general idea, we have a basic metabolic rate of about 3 to 4 gigajoules per person and year of energy that we need, just in terms of our survival. So that's energy we take up through food. And then just to point it out, so this is on a logarithmic scale, not on a linear scale. That means we're not adding 1 with each step that we take, but we're multiplying by 10, right? So that this looks like a linear progression, but it's of course actually exponential. So if we're looking then at hunter-gatherer societies, where in terms of energy use, almost the only real difference to the basic metabolic rate is some use of firewood. Yeah, that's something that makes a big difference there. And then we're at slightly more than 10 gigajoules per person in year. The agrarian societies, which are now sedentary, which have a division of labor, which are already quite different from hunter-gatherer societies, we're looking at somewhere between 70 and 80 gigajoules per person a year. And then in our industrial societies, of course now with fossil energy carriers, we're at around 300 to 400 gigajoules per person a year, right? So we're at a factor of 100 per person and year above and beyond what would be our basic metabolic need. So just to make it very clear from the very beginning that how we organize our societies matters tremendously for the resources that we need. And if we think about this relationship and how societies have changed across the past hundreds of years, then what has become known as the Great Acceleration of resource use doesn't come as much of a surprise anymore, right? Then it becomes clear that if people are using, or if we in our societies are using so much more material and energy resources, then of course we're going to see this acceleration. On the very left, what we're looking at here is the extraction of all material resources across the globe. This in the middle graph, I'll get to it. It looks a little bit, it's a little bit dwarfed by the other flows, but it's actually extremely important. These are our societal stocks. So all of the materials that we somehow accumulate within our societies. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at the outputs. So especially at wastes and emissions. And of course, this is a crucial factor when it comes to the climate crisis, but also to other forms of pollution. And from that extraction to the processing and use and to final consumption, all of these material resource flows are of course associated with environmental impact. So it's not only when we get to the output side, but of course it's the extraction as well that plays a role there. And what the argument that I want to make today is that in understanding how societies use resources, and then also in understanding what we have to contend with for any form of post-capitalist society, is that stocks are decisive. So material stocks, and from a social metabolic perspective, what I mean by material stocks are the buildings, the infrastructures, the machinery, the durable consumer goods that we amass, that we make out of the material inputs that we have, and that are not immediately transformed into material outputs, right? Of course, everything eventually is transformed into some type of waste or emission flow, but it's a question of of time and how long these stocks are retained in the system. And what's really interesting also in terms of observing our material resource flows is that stocks have become absolutely decisive as a material sink. So as a sink for all of the inputs that we require and extract. In the early 1900s, about 25% of all material resources, and you remember from the previous graph that the total extraction was still much, much lower than it is today. And only 25% of those resources went into stocks. And today we're looking at 60% of that really tremendously high amount of extraction that we're at today that goes into material stocks. And I've just put up pictures of a few examples from the fossil energy system here, just to get us thinking about what that means. And then of course, these material stocks also importantly act as a material funnel. So the flows of resources that we extract and we use, they're increasingly channeled through these stocks, which is actually what characterizes industrialization. That even for example, for something like agriculture, which used to be a fairly straightforward throughput activity for a long time, we're now increasingly dependent on stocks in the shape of, for example, heavy machinery and buildings and infrastructures and warehouses that are needed for agricultural production in its modern industrialized form. And especially with regard to the climate crisis, it becomes very clear what type of an impact this funneling has, right? Because currently we're looking at about 650 billion tons of CO2 that will be emitted simply by using all of the already existing fossil fueled stocks until the end of their lifetime. So if we don't build another power plant, we don't excavate another mine, we don't build another car, which as I'm speaking is happening right now, then we're looking at 650 billion tons of CO2 emissions. And for comparison, under the 1.5 degrees Celsius global heating scenario that the IPCC is operating with, that would require us to limit emissions to somewhere between 420 and 580 billion tons. So we'd be above any chance of realistically achieving that simply by using the stocks we already have. And I really want to emphasize this point, because what I think it really demonstrates is that we're not only economically and morally stamped by capitalism, but we're materially stamped by capitalism. And we're going to have to deal with these stocks and with these stocks that are being built up now as we speak in any kind of post-capitalist society. And these stocks are, of course, also an important constraint to transformation. So not only to the type of future society that we can have, but also to the process of transformation, I would say. And so if we were just to look at kind of this at a very simple level, this interplay that we're looking at here, we could say that the resource use we're currently looking at, it maintains the mode of societal organization that we have, right? I don't think we can argue that it arises out of human needs in any way, shape, or form, but I think the central argument is that it sustains the mode of social organization we have. And then of course, that kind of goes into a loop, because the mode of social organization that we have, so a fossil energy system, a capitalist fossil energy system, requires a certain amount of resource use and a certain composition of that resource use. And then of course, the interesting question, and I think this is absolutely crucial, and this is also what Pat started out with, is of course the question, how does that relate to the actual benefits or social outcomes that we get from this type of resource use and from this mode of social organization? And I would argue that in our current state and time, these so-called benefits, they're merely a byproduct of other things going on. So yes, these systems that we have and these industrial systems of production that we have, they do also produce food, and they do also produce electricity that is then consumed, and they do also produce consumer goods. But I would say that that is not what they are geared towards, and that's not what they're perfected towards, to produce these things well, but that's a byproduct, and that kind of becomes their reason for being, but that's an argument that's added after the fact. And I would say that if we're looking at the system we have right now specifically, then of course, in terms of the resource use, I would agree that it's very much dominated, of course, right now by the climate crisis. But as has been stated by the previous speakers, of course, or by Pat mentioned biodiversity loss. So of course, there's other crucial things going on. Despite our knowledge of this climate crisis, we still have an ongoing transition globally to a fossil energy system. So we're still continuously, this fossil energy system is currently being expanded. It's been expanding especially strongly since 1992. So since we have the framework convention saying that we're going to deal with it. And since then it's been growing even more. Renewable energy, yes, there's quite a lot of hope and it's been developing, but it's been developing within the pockets of this fossil energy system. And I mean that both in terms of the size, the relative size, and I also mean that in terms of that it's financially still very much in the pockets of that system, right? And at the same time, economically, we have a system, of course, that's centered on growth, on capital accumulation, and on the desperate need, especially right now, for capital sinks, which is something that, of course, is very strongly related to the further buildup of exactly these stocks of the fossil energy system that are causing the problem in the first place, and that also have a strong legacy effect. And all of this is maintaining, of course, a mode of social organization that we have. And then the benefits in the system are increasingly only actually attainable to people via mass production and consumption, via access to cheap energy, via economic and material wealth. So kind of we need to buy into this system of societal organization to even have access to the benefits of this resource use anymore. And that, again, crucially has to do with the fact that we need material stocks in order for fossil fuels even to be useful to us, right? None of us could gain a lot from just having a barrel of crude oil sitting around. There's not a lot that we as humans can do with that unless we have access to a whole lot of other stuff. So if we're thinking about this relation, and then we want to know how we can transform that, of course, it's possible to have or to think of a mode of societal organization that's democratic and participatory. But if the global impacts of whatever that system is on resource use were to be neglected, then we will not achieve the benefits that we want, not in a just manner and not in the long term, because we're destroying not only the life basis for non-human life, but also for human life in the process, right? And so I think it's really essential that, of course, we take our point of departure from this question of the benefits. So what do we actually really need and want to attain? That's our point of departure. And then we ask the question, how can these benefits be attained in a just and sustainable manner within the confines, within our planetary boundaries, or however we want to call them, of the resource use that we can sustainably have, and that has to be the framework for any type of imagination we have about this mode of societal organization. And then that mode kind of becomes a tool of getting these benefits to work within the framework that we have. And I think that's a way of looking at it that then also fits very nicely into this ecological economics framework of really putting the environment as the main system, and then having economy and society function as subsystems of that. And that, of course, means that if we're looking at these resource constraints, that they're not only constraints that are in the environment and in the environment's ability to absorb, for example, our level of greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also constraints that are already in our built environment and in the stocks that we have. And in that sense, the transformation is not only going to be about labor, and it's not only going to be about the wage capital relationship, but it's also crucially going to be about what, in a very material sense, we do about these stocks that we have, and about the metabolic operating space that's still open to us. And with that, I hope I kept to the time and we have time for discussion. Thank you.
You definitely did, Anke. Don't worry about it. You're right on time, and we're actually 5 minutes ahead of our schedule. So I will take this opportunity to actually ask the panelists first if they have reactions on each other's interventions, very shortly, a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes of interactions, or of reactions on each other. If you don't have any reactions, that's okay, you don't have to, but I just want to, because I think there are many issues that were raised that potentially speak to each other. So I want to invite our panelists first, and then after 5 or 6 minutes of this kind of more internal interaction, I'm going to open it to the broader audience. So we already have very interesting questions in the Q&A box that I'm going to read out, group together and read out for everyone. But you can also use, as I said, the raise hand function of Zoom, and I will give the floor to people to actually ask their questions to our panelists. But before that, I like to invite first Pat, and then David, and then Anke to, if they want to kind of react or add to their interventions. Go ahead, Pat, please.
Pat, we don't hear you right now.
He's muted. He's muted. He has to unmute him.
I can. Yes, go ahead, Pat. I think you're unmuted now.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, David's point, I think, deals with one of the two problems that Marx raised, namely exploitation. What it doesn't do is deal with the second, which was what Marx called the anarchy of production. And if you have enterprises competing against one another and bidding for investment funds at the different levels at which they're available, the question is, how are the investments that are going to change the structure of capacity, how are they to be coordinated? The whole point about having autonomous enterprises is that they have an incentive by the fact that they're competing with other enterprises to do things which will give them an advantage. And that's what Marx meant, and what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, and Marx called the anarchy of production. So it's this process of market forces redirecting the investments, the shape of production capacity, that I think that doesn't deal with. And I'd like to hear what David has to say about that. So far as Anke's concerned, which I think is an extremely important contribution, it reminded me of the work of Kate Raworth in her development of the idea of the donut economy, where there's the inner circle is the needs that will satisfy at an acceptable level human population globally, since we want an equal distribution. And then the outer circle is the planetary boundaries. And the donut, the sort of the intersection of these two circles is the viable, sustainable area in which human needs can be satisfied without violating planetary boundaries. And her argument is that in at least 2 of the 9 planetary boundaries that are identified, we've already exceeded the sustainable level, and the others are in danger of doing so. And so that, I think, is another way of emphasizing what Anke was saying, that we have to take planetary limits, planetary boundaries very, very seriously indeed. And when we're talking about different models and different ways of approaching this, then I think we need to think about ways of doing that. Now, that raised for me the issue of the argument that the movement that's developed, the degrowth movement. And the degrowth movement, which of course is okay in terms of the developed capitalist countries, but in terms of the still developing countries, they obviously do still need to grow, but they don't need to grow by replicating the sorts of growth that the developed capitalist countries, if you like, turbocharged consumerism. I remember when I visited China about 20 years ago, cities were full of bicycles. Now they're full of cars. So one's got to take account of the way in which the system, which you of course referred to, deals with these problems. And I wondered what you thought about the idea that a Green New Deal could be shaped towards the creation of green-friendly jobs along the lines of remodeling buildings, changing production methods, etc., that would enough.
Thank you, Pat. Some of the points that you raised for David, I think there's some questions in the chat that are related to that too. So I will ask David not to necessarily directly maybe address all of those, but like just because there are questions in the chat that relate to Pat's points, but more react to or more briefly react to them. And like maybe you can, if you had the chance to look at the questions in the chat, you'll see that there are parallels. So I will ask you to be at least brief in this very short round and react to the other speakers, and then we'll have a broader discussion anyway.
I haven't looked at the chat, but one thing I did want to I was going to ask Pat whether he thought my model actually was market socialism. We have market relations, we have the market is being used there. But one thing I think is really important to stress, that democratic firms don't react to market pressures the way capitalist firms do. Capitalist firms have this massive incentive to keep growing. If you think about it, you know, you've got a firm, you've created a firm, and you're making so much money by hiring 20 people. Well, if you double the size of your firm, if demand is out there, and if you can create enough demand out there, you'll double your profits. Okay. Worker controls a firm in exactly the same circumstance. You could double the size of your firm and double the profits, but there'd be twice as many people to share it among. Worker control firms tend to expand to a certain point, and then they stop, they stabilize. Capitalist firms keep growing. You know, I like to think of it as almost a cell. Democratic firms, you know, are normal cells. They grow to a certain point, then they stop. Capitalist firms are cancer cells. They just keep growing and growing. And also, under capitalist firms, they've got the incentive to grow, not only to make more profit, but to protect themselves, you know, because you're competing, you grow or die. You know, capitalism requires growth. Individual firms are incentivized to grow. The system as a whole has to keep growing, because if you don't keep growing, you get recessions, you get crises, and so on and so forth. A democratic economy reaches a certain stage. And then also, if you think about it, new technologies come along. In a capitalist firm, those new technologies are always used, you know, decrease the cost of labor and so on. What they're never used for is what would be the natural thing to use it for in a democratic firm, a new technology. We can produce the same amount of stuff with less labor. Does that mean we're going to let go people, or let's all work less? Let's take the choice of more leisure time instead of more consumption, okay? That's a viable option. So that fits with the ecological constraints. Democratic firms don't keep growing, you know, which is one of the reasons you see, why aren't there more democratic firms if they're so successful? And a lot of the evidence shows they are successful, you know, compared to comparable capitalist firms, but they don't keep growing. They don't keep multiplying, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I think that's a crucial thing that people need to understand. And it kind of ties in with what I was going to ask Anke, and the same issue about degrowth. You know, capitalist firms, I've always argued, require growth. You know, to have a healthy capitalism, you got to keep growing. but a democratic economy doesn't have to. And again, you use the technologies that you develop. You can help poorer countries. I mean, again, that's one of the things that I didn't talk about, fair trade versus free trade. I think, we should not have our workforce, free trade is a joke. It means capital can go wherever it wants to go, and our workers, well, they can't just move anywhere they want to move. They got to compete with low wage workers. So it's race to the bottom. I argue we should have a socialist protectionism. If you're competing with a country, they're selling cheaper because their wages are less. No, we don't want that to happen. But the tariff we impose on those goods, let's send those back to the poor countries to help them. And let's remove all restrictions on intellectual property to poor countries. Of course, they can use our technologies however they want, and so on and so forth. So long as they're not using them, but they're paying their workers so little that they can still outcompete us. Well, no, we won't let that happen. But, ultimately, we've got to be aiming at degrowth. We've got to stabilize the economy. And again, it's just crazy. So many studies are out there showing just consuming more stuff doesn't make people happier. We're twice as happy now as we were, in the 1970s. We're producing consuming twice as much. That's crazy. There's this deep irrationality, in capitalism. So those were my remarks, the two of you.
Thank you. David and Anke, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's for the community that I come from. The message that both Pat and David are actually bringing across is, I think, a really important one, because I think there's a strong tendency to look at current levels of resource use and to kind of say, okay, we need to obviously reduce this, and that's almost like it's like a bummer. Like, actually everything is going really well, but unfortunately we can't keep going as we are because we have the climate crisis and we're killing all of these other forms of life and we need to just use less. But I mean, that's not the way it is. It's not like everything is going great and the only issue is that it's not environmentally friendly, but it's that wherever we look, we see different forms of injustice, of suffering. I mean, the majority of the world population is not in a very good place right now. So I think this message of we could do it differently, and this is a very important point for me, we could do it differently and use less resources doing it, kind of solving or trying to solve our environmental crises. I think that's a really important aspect, but I think it's also it's a crucial limitation, right? I don't think we can expect a system that's more just and more democratic economically and socially to automatically be environmentally just. I wish that were the case, but I don't think we can expect it to be. And I think we need to really understand what the limitations are, and we need to find a way to bring that into the equation. And I'm really eager to get into.
I'm just asked to remind everyone to speak a little slower for the translation. So just that.
Yeah, sorry, especially right now that we're speaking freely and we're all excited about our topics. Sorry, translators, and thank you for your work. And I just wanted to make one quick remark before we get into the discussion on this issue of the Green New Deal, right? I think there's a very strong limitation as to what can be done or can be achieved within the production logic of a capitalist system. And I think it's very hard to come to a politically concerted agreement these days that will seriously question the underlying laws of capitalism. So I actually, from my perspective, the more important question right now is which areas of production and consumption can we either kind of take out of the capitalist logic right now, or can we preserve from even entering into that logic? And I think there are, at the community level, there are a lot of efforts going on around all of this. And if basically we can politically make part of that part and parcel of a Green New Deal, then that seems like a strategically smart thing to do. But I think the deal as such cannot be the instrument that saves us. And I also just the very last thing, because there's always this this question of capitalism having brought forth all of this innovation and kind of further competition, bringing further technological advances. I mean, of course, one could very easily argue, imagine what we could have done if we hadn't been focused on making more profit, but if we had really been focused on using the resources we have more effectively. Imagine what we could have done there. And then the other aspect is, of course, I think we have the technology we need. It's not the issue of us not knowing how to do it and not being able to do it. I think it's the issue of not using the technology to the ends that we might use it for. And in that sense, it's not a question of further innovation, it's a question of exnovation and of kind of really getting rid of what we don't need and focusing on what is really important to achieving the social goals we have.
Thank you, Anke. So we don't have a lot of time, but I think it was a really good kind of jumpstart to the discussion. We have quite a few questions on the chat, so I'm gonna kind of group them together and like synthesize and pose them while you can use the chat box or raise your hands to ask questions. There are 3 questions that are specifically directed at David's model, so I'm going to start with them, because it also, as I said, resonates with some of the issues that Pat raised. So the first question is basically from Pierre, who says, the market for goods and services function on the basis of competition between enterprises in your model, David. So each enterprise is maximizing surplus value, which would be creating a kind of a widening disproportion between the incomes of, as far as I understand, from incomes of the enterprises. But according to Marx in chapter 13 of Capital, volume 3, and the law of the falling rate of profit, or the tendency of the rate of profit to fall over time, this will bankrupt the system unless the rate of exploitation keeps constantly growing. So how does your model deal with this? This is the first question. Please hold on, because there are 2 more that you might want to pick up together. The second question is, should we frame the entrepreneurial capital class as a transition measure at best? Isn't framing it as a necessary source of creativity and admission that profit is the best incentive for innovation? And shouldn't our focus rather to demonstrate how a desirable amount of innovation is possible without the incentive of a private return on capital? And the last question, these are very big questions, I'm sorry, but from Michael, who is basically saying that it seems the core of your proposal is to keep markets but replace privately owned workplaces with cooperative enterprises. But it seems they will exist alongside private workplaces. It seems in your model, the state would need to use a heavy hand to ensure that private workplaces don't pop up and cause all of the current inequalities from occurring. How exactly would you propose that the state enforce this type of model or deal or manage with this contradiction? This is Construction Montreal happening at the background, sorry for that. Would this take the form of abolishing wage labor similar to how slave labor was abolished? So I will give it to David, and I will ask David to be as brief as possible, because there are many other questions that are more generally directed at the panelists.
David, we don't hear you right now. You're
muted. You're muted.
Yeah.
The democratic firms in my model are owned by the state. Workers lease the state those. That's why they have to pay the capital assets tax, which is basically a leasing fee, which goes into the public investment fund. Okay. Do I think, so I don't think there's exploitation going on here. Firms do compete, but again, worker controlled firms, you don't have any interest in driving your opponent out of business. You know, I often use the idea that kind of competition you're going to see you do see among democratic firms is kind of like universities competing. In Chicago, we had the Loyola University, two Catholic universities, DePaul and Loyola, which I attended, was teaching the second. We compete for students. We want to have the best product, but we have no interest whatsoever in driving the other thing out of business. We don't want to expand. Why would we want to double the size? Our departments would be double in the size. There's no incentive whatsoever. So the idea that democratic firms reach a certain point, they're not, the rate of profit isn't what's at issue here. Are you making enough money, which basically would be paying your workers, you are the owners of the company. You're not the owners, but the profit that you make gets divided among the workers there. Okay. If other companies are making the same thing and they're not doing as efficiently, well, their workers won't do as well. So they've got an incentive to try to improve their efficiency to match what you guys have and so on. I think there's a difference between healthy competition and this destructive competition. So again, how to keep the capitalists in check? I think it's the other way around. I mean, small businesses, and so on and so forth. Well, they've got to compete with democratic firms. They've got to entice their workers to stay with them rather than have a firm that's more democratically controlled. So, I don't think there's any danger of the private firms, driving the other ones out of business. The small firms are going to have to do what they can to keep the laborers there. That's quick. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll pass it on.
Thank you, David. So there are three questions that I'm going to kind of synthesize right now, and there are three people who have raised hands, so hopefully we can get to all. So the first question to all kind of panelists is from Peter, who's saying, can we advance to a system where money and capital no longer exists, where wages also don't exist, and what's the next level? So maybe all panelists can kind of ponder on like the limits of having a money-based kind of capital and wage system in kind of a post-capitalist economy. The second question is from Audrey, who says, I would be interested to hear what the panelists anticipate in terms of the restructuring of the current division of labor, especially all the current economic sectors that support the capitalist economy and the bullshit jobs required to do so. And I think Pat has already kind of made some comments, and I think it's a really important question to entertain. And the last one I gonna say is that what do all the speakers and the facilitator, I'm not gonna take take up space and answer that, but think of the existing measures of handling basically existing debt. So like initiatives like the debt jubilee or another form of handling existing debt today, and what that implies for a post-capitalist system. So I'm gonna ask the panelists to follow the order of the first initial order. So I'm going to give it to Pat first. You can choose what question to start with or to answer. You can address any or all of the questions, Pat, and please unmute yourself. Thank you.
Muted. Pat's still muted.
I'm not sure that I caught all the questions, actually, Bengi. I'm sorry.
Okay, let me summarize. The question of division of labor and bullshit jobs, the question of having a money and wage system in a post-capitalist economy, and the question of how to deal with existing debt today, and what you think of some initiatives and proposals around that, like the debt jubilee or cancellation of debt and things like that.
Okay, well, when it comes to division of labor, I think I tried to suggest that the functional division of labor, specialisms in different sorts of activity is okay and is probably necessary, but the what I call the social division of labor, which is people spending most of their lives doing one sort of activity, unskilled work, skilled work, caring work, professional work, that is not fully life enhancing. We should all do, if you like, some of all these different types of works, either at the same time or at different stages in our lives. And that, I think, would mean that people would feel more in control of not only what they're doing, but their relationship to other people, not only the product of what they're doing, but the product of what other people do as well, and so on. So that would be my view on that. I think that a money and wage system, if the money is used to facilitate exchange, is okay. But I think when it comes to, if you like, money used as capital, then that's not okay. And that I don't think could exist in a post-capitalist system. And thirdly, on debt, I think at the moment the proposals to cancel debt are proposals which we should fully support, just as I think the proposals to give up intellectual property rights, particularly in the present COVID crisis with respect to vaccinations, is again something we should fully support. I would see these, if you like, as a sort of transitional demands, still within capitalism, but demands which are actually moving in the direction of a solidaristic relationship to other people and the rest of the world, rather than in a, let's have all the vaccinations for our country, never mind the others until we've had enough ourselves. So I think those are the short answers to the three questions.
Okay, my turn. Okay, quick, short answers. First of all, the idea of bullshit jobs. I would argue in a cooperative enterprise, you're not going to see bullshit jobs. I mean, when the people that have those jobs are there, at the assemblies, expressing their concerns and so on and so forth, we're in a position, we won't tolerate that, I don't think. Also, I like to think of, Marx talks about the withering away of the state, the gradual, I like to think of the withering away of the market under market socialism. Once it stabilizes, once you've got enterprises that basically reach a certain size and they use their technologies to make life more interesting and so on and so forth, that just, you don't need more competition. Doesn't have to be fierce anymore. You kind of compete. We see, oh, they got a good idea over there, let's do that too. But you're not worried about those sorts of things. Once the financial anxiety goes away, everybody has a job, everybody has these social benefits and so on and so forth. Likewise with the debt, yes, absolutely, debt should be forgiven. That is, again, one of the things that's within our reach right now. People are talking about that. Education should be free. My God, student debt is just off the charts. I can't believe some of my students, I got $50,000 in debt already. This is unbelievable. So no, I think that also we definitely want to get rid of debt. There's a lot of moves we can make in those directions right now.
Yeah, I only want to add one very small point to what the other two have said and what I agree very much with. And that's that, of course, if we kind of in this, let's say, vicious cycle that we're in right now, if we want to break the link between having to become wealthier for the sake of the system, so having to grow economically, I think there was also a question about that in the chat, needing more resources for that, and kind of having both those things be the prerequisite for our so-called human well-being, then I think actually this questioning the role of labor is essential in that, right? And I think this issue that's been raised of reducing labor time, looking at affluence, not where it's possible, not in monetary terms, but in terms of time, I think that's essential. And that's, I mean, wherever, obviously that's not something that's currently applicable to everyone and internationally, but where we can kind of break these cycles within the existing system, I think that can be like a really valuable step. Otherwise, I totally agree with what was already said.
Thank you. We have 1 minute, but I think we can go over a few minutes. So I'm going to give it, because there are 3 questions in that have raised hands. So I'm going to give it to them, but I'm going to ask the audience to please be as brief as possible in their questions and refrain from making extensive comments, but rather kind of formulate questions. So I'll give it to Sydney, who's had their hand up for a while. Sydney, please go ahead. I'm not sure if Sydney is still there. Okay. Spooky, can you go ahead? Now you have your hand up to ask a question.
For Spooky, it's not possible to talk because the person is using an older version of Zoom.
Okay.
So maybe,
maybe you can
I
chat.
can see that right now.
Yeah, okay. Spooky, if you want, you can type your question on the chat and I will read it for you. In the meanwhile, I'm going to give it to Geru, if I'm saying it correctly. I hope I am. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good actually for pronunciation. So one direct question to to Mr. Schweickart. What article or what paper were you reading for your presentation? That's pretty much straightforward. But I have 2 little commentaries actually. I have my concerns on the over-reliance on technology on that transition from a capitalist or post-capitalist society. Some movement on the left are a bit too much reliable on my sense, and I want you to comment on this. And also the over-reliance also on the from left movements on the concept of democracy. So people are a bit, I'm not saying I'm not against democracy, but the over-reliance that democracy is a fact and it's given to us, and everyone is moving toward democracy, and everyone wants like democracy and want democracy in social life, political life, and also in the labor market, or actually, sorry, in the enterprise market, or cooperatives, everything. And there's a few problems with that. Democracy doesn't have the same prerogative depending on which tendency you have. It doesn't materialize the same way whatever groups you're are using the word. And mostly people right now are pretty much using or associating democracy to a liberal democracy, which is not the same as maybe a more socialist democracy. So I would like some comments on those 3 things. But thank you for the presentation. They were pretty good.
Okay, quick on the last one, democracy. The democratic impulse is basically the idea that decisions that affect me, I ought to have some input, into dealing with them. So I think the democracy itself, all kinds are kind of under threat now, because we're certainly seeing the rise of authoritarian institutions. And of course, in the United States and other capitalist countries, we say we're democratic. We are not democratic. I can't believe that anyone seriously believes that. Clearly, you're controlled by the capitalist class, and more people are aware of that, which is why the right is mobilizing, because they see this, especially students are getting turned into socialists and so on and so forth, because they're taking these issues seriously, democracy. So, I think, the problem isn't, it's getting clear about what we mean by democracy. Yeah, we don't mean, just having a Senate gets to vote on things. It means individuals need to have the right to input, which is why cooperatives are democratic, that idea. And the other 2 questions, I forgot what they are. I'm sorry. Or
I will just intervene to say there's actually another panel at 3:30. So
I
go over time, but I'm gonna ask you to limit just like the comments to a few minutes, and we're gonna wrap it up. So I'm gonna actually pass it to Pat if he has comments on the question. And I'm gonna remind him to unmute. Pat, yeah. Okay.
Can you remind me of the question?
I can speak again if it's okay with you. The first one actually was from which article or paper you were reading, Mr. Schwartz. But for the other one actually was the concept of the over-reliance on technology as a transition for post-capitalist society. And the second one was mostly the over-reliance actually of the misconception actually of the term of democracy used right now, and how we can implement it in a more meaningful way in our society right now. So for a future of post-capitalistic socialist movement.
Could I just jump in quickly and say the paper that was a paper I just wrote for this conference right now. If anyone would like a copy, I could make it available to them. Pass it to Pat.
Okay, I mean, I think that if we're thinking of a transition, it's got to be a political process. It can't be, as it were, building pockets of alternative non-capitalist ways in more and more parts of the system until it eventually takes over the whole system. No, I think that prefigurative examples of some of the sort that have been mentioned are very, very important in creating, if you like, what Gramsci, in his view of transition, called the war of position. That's to say, institutions in civil society which are trying to live in different ways, informed by different ideologies, and which, when it comes to a war between alternative ideologies, like, say, neoliberalism and real democratic advance, these institutions in civil society which have been built up can be, as it were, called upon to support those changes. But in the end, it's got to be things that contribute to a political process of changing the system, because basically capitalism is a system in which power is very unequally distributed. And if you think of the discussions that are going on in the United States at the moment, which David will know more about than I do, but I mean, the way in which the funding of the Republicans, in particularly against the proposals of Biden and the new Democratic Socialists grouping within the Democratic Party, you know, the difference in funding means that it's not really a democracy where everybody is equally placed and has an equal say. So I think one's got to welcome prefigurative movements and so on, but not think that they're going to be an answer to the problem, that they have to feed into a political process if they are to be effective in the long run.
Thank you, Pat. That's very, I think that was a really thought-provoking answer for the question of democracy, that the prefigurative movements that are existing. So I'm going to pass it to Anke, and I'm going to close the panel afterwards. So invite Anke to make her comments.
Yes, I just want to comment briefly on the question of technology, and I'll also tie that up with at least a partial answer to what Spooky, I think it was, wrote in the chat, the person who couldn't get their microphone on before. So I think technology at this point in time is going to have to play a central role, both in a transformation, but then also in a future society. So I think at this point there's kind of no going back to a romanticized pre-technological era. I think that to kind of make do with very limited resources, we're going to have to use those more intelligently than we can perhaps do using only our human brains. So we're going to rely on computing power, for example. And I think that from that perspective, this question of producing what can be produced in the homes and decentrally, I think that there can't be a blanket answer to that. I think if we basically kind of have time affluent societies where people have more time because they have to engage in wage labor less, then there are, and if there are things that can be produced that mainly require time, if they are produced by individuals, then that's fine. But actually a lot of production is much more inefficient in terms of the resources and the energy needed if everyone does it individually, rather than kind of sharing in larger technologies, sharing machines, all of these things. So I think we really will have to make a distinction there. And I think for most of consumption, both of goods and of services, I think there will have to be some sort of communal production. Yeah, it doesn't have to be via companies and enterprises, but it has to be on the basis of, especially of shared technology.
Thank you, Anke, and thank you everyone for the very, very thought-provoking and interesting interventions and the thought-provoking and interesting questions. I just wanted to, since we're on the topic of technology, partially, I just want to remind you that the third panel on the series of the panels is actually on democratic planning and technology. So I invite everyone to zoom into that panel too. And thank you again, and thank you the panelists. I want to thank them especially for their acceptance and for their interventions. And have a nice rest of the conference, everyone.
Thanks to everybody.